this is just a brief introduction to Adobe Illustrator in case you missed what we were talking about in class. So I'm just going to go over a few things. First of all, any piece of software, as soon as you are logged into your account, you can go to the Launchpad here to find it and use your scroll button to go through several pages. If we want Adobe Illustrator, you can actually grab any piece of software you want and move it down here onto the dock. I already have it here, but you can place it down there so you have access to it. Go ahead and click it to open it. Now when you first open Illustrator, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. If you go up to where it says Illustrator, or really any piece of software on Apple, where you see its name up top, that's where you get to the preferences. So usually things like changing the units to inches, because most of us work in inches or decimal inches. But we have some other options here. For instance, if you nudge with the keyboard side to side, that's the amount it will go, a fraction of an inch, which is usually good. Okay, we have our type, units, guides and grids. This is just how guides and grids show up, the colors and everything, and how wide they are. We can turn off hyphenation, things like that. Change the user interface if it's hard on your eyes. So I'll hit OK. Next is File. You can create new documents here. You can open a document, or you can go to Recent Files. We can save as, save a copy, make templates. We can place a graphic in here. So if you're trying to place a JPEG in here to trace, that's a good place to do it. And in the end, these graphics, Adobe Illustrator graphics, aren't something you can put on the internet. You have to use special programs called vector software to open them. So if you're sending them to a client or the internet, you would probably have to export a JPEG or a PNG. So we can export a copy of these that is able to be used on the internet, or to send to someone who doesn't have a vector art program. So notice all the things we can save them as. So here's where you'll find JPEG and PNG, for instance. You can click this to expand, and then choose a place you want it to go, create a new folder, choose the file type, etc., and then export it when you're done. Okay, next, let's talk a little bit about the tools and the workspace. So the workspace here is set in something we call Essentials. Now, there are other ways you can set this up, and they're going to change how all these palettes work. I recommend starting with Essentials. Now, there's always a time when someone moves something and loses it. So if you ever misplace anything or move anything in a way you don't like, go to Window, Workspace, and you can reset the workspace. So everything goes back to where it was. Alright, next, when we're dealing with objects, most of that's up here where we can transform them, move, rotate, reflect, which is like flipping it horizontally, scaling or resizing it, etc. And we have our arranges, because objects here can go in front of or back of each other. We have a black arrow. We have a black arrow here for moving whole objects, and a white arrow for moving parts of objects. Here we have our pen tool. Now we can choose a fill color and a stroke color. This will be the inside, and this will be the lines around the object. We can click and pull out certain shapes. And then when you get to the end here, or the beginning point, you'll see that the circle pops up. This is showing you this will create a filled object. It has a border all the way around it. So this stroke right now is kind of small. One other thing I recommend you do is go to Window and turn on Control. That brings up this bar with a bunch of useful options. So if we use a black arrow to select this, notice I have quick access to the stroke, which increases the size of the line around the art. Now, speaking of the stroke around it, we can also change the way it looks. And we can even do dashed lines, round end caps, etc. Notice the dashed lines there. Okay, so remember black arrow to move whole objects, white arrow to move parts of objects. So if we were to draw something with the pen, like this, the way the white arrow works is that I can deselect and grab any specific point or its handle. The handle will control rotation based on length and direction. Now notice when I move one handle, the other moves too if it's a curve. Now if you want it to go from a curve to a straight line, you have to use a special tool here. Or you have to do it when you create the line. So anything with that little triangle down there, you can hold down and find additional tools. I'm looking for the anchor point tool. This allows me to change a curve point into a straight point by clicking on it. Or if I drag it out, I can move the handles individual of each other. So it goes from a straight line into a curve. If I hit A, I'll switch back to the subselection tool here, so I can select that, then hit Shift C if I want to use a shortcut. Another option we have, if you want to do that while creating the object, is to use the pen tool. And notice when I go through a curve, if I go back over the point I just made, I get that small V. So if I click again, instead of going to another curve point, it will go from a curve to a sharp point. So a lot of times you would have to click a point a second time to get the effect you want. We have a few other useful tools here. We have text. We have text on a path, which will let you click on a path and put text on it. If you do that, the white arrow will help you pull lines that tell it where it starts and stops and where the middle is. So we have a couple options here as far as pulling these lines. You can also still change the font size. Once again with the control bar here. We have rotation transforms here, reflections, and an eraser. Now if I select all using Command A or by going to Edit, select all, select and all, I can delete everything at once or move everything at once. Now if I have multiple objects, I can change the arrangement in front of or behind each other. So I'll send this backwards. Now it's behind that. I'll make another circle here, and I can send this back one layer at a time, or I can bring it all the way to the front at once or all the way to the back at once. So those commands are here in the range, although I use these shortcut keys. We can select multiple objects and hit Command G to group them. That makes it easy to grab one and move the other, or move them as a unit. You can find grouping in Object. Right there, group and ungroup. So I can ungroup that as well by hitting Shift Command G. So Command G will group them, Shift Command G will ungroup them. We can use we can use gradients here. If we take an object, we can click on gradient or double click it if we want to change the colors. Click on here to set points. And once we have that gradient, we're on the gradient tool, we can drag it in different directions. We can also change the meeting points between the colors, rotation, things like that. We can change it to a radial gradient or a freeform gradient. So a freeform gradient lets you put in points that are going to be a certain color. And for each of these points, we can also do opacity. So you could have a certain point be semi-transparent, and then something you put behind it is going to show through. So let's make a blue circle here, put it behind it, and notice that overlap where we turn the opacity down on that point. For colors, we can double click these and choose first the basic color, and then dive into a more specific color, or use any of these to choose a specific color. When it comes to lines, we can use the pen tool I told you about, or the pencil, which works on the stroke color. It doesn't have a fill in this case. Or we can use the brush tool. Brush tool is hidden under here. Brush tool can use a variety of different strokes. Also, if you're using a tablet and need pen pressure, double clicking on this brush here is where you'd set up with pressure. Always make sure your size matches your variation and pressure is turned on. That will allow you to use brushes that start out thinner, or use pressure to change the size. We do have a help section up here if you need it. Last but not least, we have layers. In layers here, you can turn the visibility of a layer on or off. You can lock them. You can see the individual components, and you can add layers down here with the new page. So if you put a layer behind something, you can start adding artwork behind it that will not affect what's on the layer above. So if I were to start drawing, notice that because it's on the layer behind, it will go behind the other artwork, and I can turn them off and on individually, lock them individually, delete them, or add layers in between them.